Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG show for Wednesday, March the 9th, 2022. There's been a lot of Ukrainian patriotism that we've seen in the last few weeks, and rather strangely, an enormous amount of Ukrainian patriotism in Britain, United States, Canada, and elsewhere. And that got me to thinking about the nature of patriotism in the globalist world we live in, whether patriotism, true patriotism, is even possible. I mean, if we don't have nations anymore, if we don't even have countries anymore, if we're merely administrative units, then what could patriotism actually mean? And I want to talk a bit about my own benighted country of Canada. Here's a statement made by Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada at the time, to the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. That's significant. I'll get to that later. On October the 9th, 1971. This is a speech in which he unveiled the concept of official multiculturalism, which has been the dominating idea of Canada since 1971, 51 years now. This is what Trudeau had to say. Uniformity is neither desirable nor possible in a country the size of Canada. We should not even be able to agree upon the kind of Canadian to choose as a model, let alone persuade most people to emulate it. There are few policies potentially more disastrous for Canada than to tell all Canadians that they must be alike. There is no such thing as a model or ideal Canadian. What could be more absurd than the concept of an all-Canadian boy or girl? A society which emphasizes uniformity is one which creates intolerance and hate. A society which eulogizes the average citizen is one which breeds mediocrity. What the world should be seeking, and what in Canada we must continue to cherish, are not concepts of uniformity, but human values, compassion, love, and understanding, unquote. You note the straw man here, that unity equals uniformity. Oikophobia, as Roger Scruton used the word, that's what we're talking about here. That the foreign is what Canada really is, and the foreign is what Canada has become. Now, it's arguable that Canada is certainly not a nation. Quebec is a nation, has been declared by the House of Commons, I believe, unanimously. English Canada doesn't get to be a nation, of course, because English Canada was born of evil. We don't have patriotism. It was Trudeau and his predecessor, Lester Pearson, who was a KGB agent, by the way. That's not an exaggeration. It's true. Who destroyed the old Canadian patriotism, which was largely based on the British Empire. We had first official biculturalism, notwithstanding the fact that apart from, a very small part of Ontario and northern New Brunswick, the French speakers are in Quebec. But we must live this illusion that, yes, there are French speakers everywhere and French culture everywhere in Canada. There isn't. So we famously got French on the cornflakes boxes and everything else that is sold in this country at an enormous cost to business and to us, because we have to pay the cost of it. We got everything got turned around. Like Canadian Airlines Air Canada and Canada Post, not the Royal Mail, but Canada Post or Post Canada. That all of the symbols of the old Canada were inverted or eliminated, such as the Canadian flag, which was eliminated. The red ensign was replaced in 1965 by a generic deracinated flag. Even so, as we learned in the last few weeks, The truckers and those protesting vaccine mandates, mask requirements, and the like, are fond of using the Canadian flag. And a Canadian a CBC producer reporter, she said publicly that this made her anxious. So even a generic deracinated symbol of Canada is too much for Canada's elite. I suppose these people must have thought that in eliminating the old Canadian patriotism, a new, better Canadian patriotism would be created, but that is not, in fact, what happened. What happened was a vacuum was created, which was filled up largely with American culture. There is little to no Canadian culture or art to speak of. Seriously, there isn't. Any Canadian with any talent or ambition buggers off to America the first chance he gets. Many famous Canadian actors, such as Lorne Greene and Christopher Plummer and William Shatner, perfected their trade in Canada on the stage and on the CBC. That doesn't happen anymore. It simply doesn't happen. There is nothing here in Canada for people of artistic people of talent and ambition. Now, Quebec still has its own culture, even though they have very foolishly decided to import enormous numbers of people from North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa because they speak French. It turns out that and from Haiti, the worst country in the Western Hemisphere. Oh, they speak French. Well, they have nothing in common with the Quebecois, and they simply identify as the other. Now, a Quebecois novelist named Yann Martel, some years ago, won the Booker Prize. And in his speech, he spoke of Canada being the greatest hotel on earth. He actually meant that as a compliment. And people ran with that. And no one has run further with it than Justin Trudeau, who, of course, is the son of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, although many people believe that he is the natural son of Fidel Castro. Now, a man called Charles Foran wrote an essay in The Guardian, in 2017, and this fellow is the CEO of the Institute for Canadian Citizenship. And what does Canadian citizenship mean? It means anyone who bothers to show up. Do you know you only have to be in this country for 3 years to be issued citizenship? And you don't have to spend the whole of the 3 years there. Just a so-called majority of 3 years, which leads itself to endless scams, one I witnessed at firsthand. Some years ago, I was renting most of a house from a Chinese landlord, and he had some cousins or whatever in a very small part of the house, very, very small part of the house. But I noticed that we were getting all this mail for a similar name, but not people who lived in the little part of the house. And then the mystery was dispelled when one day a BMW or an Audi showed up, and two very well-dressed Chinese couple came out. They had a child in the back to pick up all their mail, many of which was financial, real estate associated. And I realized what this was. They'd established a mail drop in Victoria. They lived at the time in Hong Kong or Singapore or Manila or whatever, but they wanted Canadian citizenship as a bolt hole, and presumably they got it. But Charles Foran writes in The Guardian, as 2017 begins, Canada may be the last immigrant nation left standing. I don't really know what that is supposed to mean, but presumably Foran believes that's a good thing. Our government believes in the value of immigration, as does the majority of the population. Well, given that there is nothing else on offer, given that any voice of sanity regarding immigration in Canada has been, extirpated, I suppose we really don't have much choice. We took in an estimated 300,000 newcomers in 2016, including 48,000 refugees, and we want them to become citizens. Around 85% of permanent residents eventually do. Yes, well, that's now up to over 400,000 a year in a country of only 38 million. This is the great replacement. Of course, it's not happening, but it's good that it is. Foreign continues. Recently, there have been concerns about bringing in single Arab men, but otherwise, Canada welcomes people from all faiths and corners. The Greater Toronto Area is now the most diverse city on the planet, with half its residents born outside the country, which apparently is a good thing. Vancouver, Calgary, Ottawa, and Montreal aren't far behind. Of course, Vancouver is now a minority city as well. Annual immigration accounts for roughly 1% of the country's current population of 36 million. Canada has been overpraised lately for, in effect, going about our business as usual. In 2016, well, that's not true. Roughly about the same time that the United States slashed immigration, Canada did too. And those rules obtained until 1967, when our elite, secretly, as it turned out, decided to open Canada to the world, all of it. In 1966, Canada was approximately 97% white. In 2016, such luminaries as US President Barack Obama and Bono, no less, declared the world needs more Canada. In October, The Economist blared, "Liberty moves north, Canada's example to the world," on its cover, illustrated by the Statue of Liberty haloed in a maple leaf and wielding a hockey stick. The Statue of Liberty, of course, is an American symbol, not a Canadian symbol, but that doesn't seem to bother Charles Foran. And in fact, Emma Lazarus's doggerel, which has been applied to the base of the Statue of Liberty, has perverted its original meaning. The Statue of Liberty was a gift, of course, from the government of France to America, a celebration of the historic friendship between the countries and a celebration of liberty, not a celebration of letting in anybody who shows up. But of course, Canadians, elite Canadians, like to trumpet how much different they are from Americans, but that is not true. Of course, they all belong to a global elite, and the Statue of Liberty is now apparently as Canadian as it is American. Of course, 2016, Foreign continues, was also the year, really the second running, when many Western countries turned angrily against immigration, blaming it for a variety of ills, and what journalist Doug Saunders, one of the worst and most dangerous man in my country, calls the global reflex appeal to fear. Alongside the rise of nativism has emerged a new nationalism that can scarcely be bothered to deny its roots in racial identities and exclusionary narratives. Yes, you are Canadian, but you are not. Yes, apparently even the idea that there are 38 million Canadian, although many millions of them are now just paper citizens, that's not enough. Canada means the whole world, and when Trudeau became Prime Minister in 2015, that's pretty much what he said. Come on in, all of you, all of you. We got plenty of room. Well, we got plenty of room in the frozen north, not so much room in Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, Edmonton, Calgary, etc., where housing prices continue to rise. I mean, the housing prices are so high in Vancouver and Toronto now that one would get the impression that everyone who lives there is a millionaire. No, but we're going to bring in 1.3 million people over the next 3 years, or 1.7 million over 4 years, and they're all going to have to live somewhere. And the fact that that makes Canada's cities unaffordable to Canadians, well, tough dookie. That's the way it goes. You know, your parents should have been born rich. Now, Justin Trudeau made a famous statement that Canada, and apparently this was a good thing. He was interviewed by the New York Times Magazine. He said that Canada could be the first post-national state. He added, "There is no core identity, no mainstream in Canada." Well, that's the inevitable result of multiculturalism, which is a universal solvent. It destroys all loyalties, all rules, all customs. But again, that is apparently a good thing. Now, a woman called Natalie Brender, and I looked her up, and apparently you've never heard of her, and no one in Canada has ever heard of her, but she is deeply embedded in the elite. Described as a Ottawa-based public policy professional and writer specializing in science policy, international policy, Canadian politics, and, wait for it, diversity. Her experience spans academia, federal politics, think tanks, and nonprofits, but of course, including a recent role as director of the Genomics and Society program at Genome Canada. The woman, apparently Center for International Policy Studies, director of policy at Canadian this and that. Apparently, this woman has done everything. Employed with Social Services and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And of course, when she gives her opinion, the fact that she is working for the government certainly doesn't have anything to do with her independence. No, her independence is assured. The fact that so many of our opinion mongers now are either PR spivs or are funded by the government, and that includes the bulk of the media, newspapers in my country. No. That certainly wouldn't be a stain on their independence. But as long ago as 2008, in the wake of Jan Martel's comment, she was keen to put us in our place about what that means. This is in the Ottawa Citizen. Canada was never a hotel. It's time to lay to rest a tired metaphor that misrepresents the meaning of citizenship for naturalized and native-born Canadians alike. Well, as far back as 1967, the Canadian Department of Immigration decided that it was its goal to erase the distinction between native-born Canadians and immigrants. She begins, since 2002, when novelist Jan Martel described Canada as the greatest hotel on earth, a swath of the nation's pundit class embraced his words as a metaphor of national decline. Though Martel has clarified that he meant only to celebrate the fact that Canada welcomes people from everywhere and has the variety of peoples of a hotel, the pundits persist in their Hotel Canada laments. Recently, former Pearson assistant Tom Kent charged that Canada is, quote, the hotel among countries, a place to which you come and go at your convenience, unquote. Now, that's Tom Kent. Now, we're going back a long ways there, and you can't get any more old school establishment liberal than Tom Kent. But even Tom Kent thought that world's greatest hotel, that was going too far. Brender continues, other commentators have also used the metaphor to deplore what they see as the uncommitted attitudes of recent immigrants who lack any intention of becoming rooted and loyal Canadians. Where's the lie? Because so-called citizens of convenience retain strong attachments to the identities, partisans, and histories of their homelands, the lament often continues, their presence threatens to undermine Canadian solidarity and national values. Well, it already has. Elections in Canada the campaigns take place in many, many different languages. And often, or usually, the head offices of these parties have no idea what the candidates are saying because they don't speak Chinese or Punjabi or Urdu or Tagalog or whatever. According to Brender, though, it is unfortunate this Hotel Canada lament has gained such prominence since the litany of complaints it typically includes lacks both historical perspective and fair-minded reasoning about the meaning and nature of citizenship for naturalized and native-born Canadians alike. And these weaknesses matter because the lament tends to surface in reactions to events such as the 2006 evacuation of Canadian citizens from war-torn Lebanon, or the federal government's proposed new immigration legislation. Yes, in 2006, Canadians discovered, to their amazement, that there were something like 200,000 Canadian citizens in Lebanon. How did that happen? Well, it's pretty obvious how it happened, because they got their Canadian citizenship, like that Chinese couple I described earlier. They just regarded Canada as a bolt hole. Misused by prominent commentators on such occasions, the metaphor distorts important realities. Oh, yes, explain reality to us. And has the potential to lead national conversations about citizenship seriously astray. It's high time to expose the unsoundness of the Hotel Canada lament and lay it to rest once and for all. Consider first the charge that recent newcomers are uncommitted to Canada and to becoming Canadian. Well, Don Cherry, who is the most famous sportscaster in Canadian history and one of the most famous, perhaps most famous broadcasters in Canadian history, lost his job a couple of years ago when he pointed out that so many of these new and better than us Canadians don't bother to wear a poppy to commemorate Remembrance Day. How dare you? How dare you, Mr. Cherry? Even the Royal Canadian Legion, for which Don Cherry has done yeoman work for decades, decided to throw him under the bus. In making this claim, pundits claim unrooted immigrant behavior, such as supporting homeland political or community causes, following homeland news and ethnic media outlets, or cheering for homeland sports teams in international competitions. The cause of such defective citizenship, critics often allege, is the easy facilitation of homeland ties through email, ethnic media channels, cheap phone calls, and air travel. However, concerns about immigrant rootlessness are not new to the era of globalization. The late 19th and early 20th century saw Anglo-Saxon critics in both Canada and the US complaining that immigrants at the time from Southern and Eastern Europe had divided loyalties and attitudes incompatible with national values. Yes, I suppose the Cosa Nostra would be one example of that. I'll give you an example, okay? The fellow who wrote that book, White Shift, Kaufman, I think his name is. Here, let me look this up here. I reviewed the book a couple of years ago on the old book club on Luke Ford channel. Eric Kaufman, yes. I years ago, this would have been in 2001 or 2002, I interviewed Kaufman's father, who lives in Vancouver. And I believe he is married to a Chinese woman, and he's fluent in Chinese. And he told me that he was listening to Chinese ethnic radio in Vancouver on September 11th, 2001. And he reported to me that the majority of callers celebrated the destruction of the Twin Towers and the attack on the Pentagon as because America deserved to be punished because America had attacked our embassy in Belgrade in 1999. They didn't mean the Canadian embassy. They meant the Chinese embassy. Here, I'll give you another example. At the time of the APEC conference in Vancouver, it was 98 or 1999, when Chinese dictator showed up, that Chinese students at the University of British Columbia demanded that all pro-Tibet signs be removed from residents' windows. And indeed, they were. The Ukrainians from Eastern Europe came in large numbers around the turn of the century. And there is no question that they were discriminated against by older stock Canadians. They were mocked for their language, for their accent, for their clothing, for their habits, and it was ordered of them that they become Canadian. And over time, they did. But to what extent they are actually a Canadian is an interesting question now. With Chrystia Freeland, who has a Ukrainian grandfather, dead, who was a leading Nazi collaborator during World War II, and so important that he ended up as a U.S. military asset in Bavaria in 1945. Well, Chrystia Freeland, her mother co-wrote the Ukrainian Constitution. Chrystia Freeland and her sister own an apartment in Kyiv. And Chrystia Freeland, the way she's been talking in the last few weeks, one is tempted to ask, are you the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada or the Deputy Prime Minister of the Ukraine? Frank Hilliard wrote in the Council of European on the Council of European Canadians website back in August 2014, The Origins of Multiculturalism in Canada, the Ukrainian Connection. Multiculturalism arrived in Canada almost literally out of the blue. One moment we were improving our bilingual and bicultural character with a royal commission, and the next moment all that was thrown out the window and a new concept adopted. I was alive during that period, but I must have been asleep, as were almost all of my fellow Canadians. I hardly noticed as the nature of the country was fundamentally changed. Looking back, I see an Expo 67 in Montreal as a theater that deluded us all. It was a great world exposition. Anyone who attended was impressed with the swirl of ethnic diversity and color. The music, the costumes, the pavilions, the delicious food and drink. Having a multicultural country seemed like a great idea. What we failed to realize was that the law governing the exposition and the people who attended it was Canadian criminal law, which in turn was based on English common law, British parliamentary traditions, English concepts of liberal democracy, the separation of church and state. We fail to realize that law itself is basically just codified culture. If we opened ourselves to all cultures and if we made them all equal to Canada's identity, our laws, based on our English and French heritage, would eventually have to change into something else. Our institutions would eventually have to reflect other values. Just 4 years later, in 1971, Prime Minister Trudeau introduced his multiculturalism policy, which would in effect turn all of Canada into a World's Fair, announcing in Parliament, "It was the view of the Royal Commission shared by the government and, I am sure, by all Canadians," ho ho, very satirical, "that there cannot be one cultural policy for Canadians of British and French origin, another for the original peoples, and yet a third for all others. For although there are two official languages, there is no official culture, nor does any ethnic group take precedence over any other." No one noticed as the train left the station where it was heading. In the train wreck that is Multiculturalism Canada, Pierre Trudeau has to take pride of place. It was the above cited on October 8, 1971, on presenting the fourth report of the Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism, which created Canada's policy of multiculturalism. But even a clever and willful prime minister can't act on his own. Trudeau was supported, encouraged, and prodded by others who wanted to do away with English and French culture and replace it with a mosaic, including their own. Who were these guilty men who played a part in ruining the country? I found one answer in an article in the Canadian Ethnic Studies Journal by Julia Lalande. After giving some background on the reasons for the B&B Commission, she moved to the role of the Ukrainian community in Canada, which was beginning to flex its muscles. The problem for the Ukrainians about the Bicultural Commission, she says, was that it was all about biculturalism. Many groups that were part of the third force, the most vocal of which was the Ukrainian Canadian community, were exasperated by the Commission's focus on bilingualism, but talk of biculturalism frustrated them even more. To change the focus, the Ukrainians started a massive lobbying campaign to open biculturalism up and convert it holus bolus into multiculturalism. The lobbying campaign must be what Heritage Canada describes as many, particularly from Western Canada, mounted a campaign for recognition without naming the many it refers to. This leads to a fundamental question. Why would Ukrainians of all people want to redefine completely the cultural character of the country that gave them freedom, economic opportunity, and safety? Didn't they realize that celebrating multiple cultures as if they were all equally important to Canada's identity and as if the country had not been founded primarily by British culture would weaken and eventually destroy the very laws and traditions which protected them? Didn't anyone think this through beforehand? Or was it all painted Easter eggs as far as they were concerned? I can now put one name on the list of guilty men. It is Isidore Hinka, who according to Wikipedia, argued that Canada was in fact multilingual and multiculturalism with two main working languages, Quebec's working language being mainly French, and the rest of Canada having English as a working language. His presentation received major news coverage across Canada and set the tone for all other ethnic groups to follow. But I was right the first time. It is Hilinka was wrong. Canada's common culture was not merely about working languages, but included as well a working set of liberal democratic institutions and traditions going back to Canada's British origins, including Magna Carta, habeas corpus, English common law, the English Bill of Rights, universal suffrage, the jury system, parliamentary democracy, capitalism, and much more. It wasn't just a language you were attacking, it was the whole ship of state, now sinking under your prescription. Isidor Hlinka is described as Wikipedia as a pioneer in the concept of multiculturalism. It would be fair to say that he was the originator, prime mover, and principal spokesperson for multiculturalism on behalf of the Ukrainian community in Canada. He worked tirelessly to promote the concept in letters, speeches, and a newspaper column in the Ukrainian Voice under the pseudonym of Ivan Harmata. Most importantly, Dr. Hlinka presented the Ukrainian-Canadian Committee's submission to the Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism. This said, to condense it into one sentence, that Canada was a multilingual and multicultural country, and that the very concept of biculturalism, the subject of the Royal Commission, was an insult to 1/3 of Canadians. Now, there's much more at this source, which you can find at eurocanadians.ca. But again, the gist of it is that ethnic minorities in this country have destroyed the very idea of Canada. It's just a hotel now, or increasingly a flop house. So why do you have all of these Canadians, not just Ukrainians, cheering on Vladimir Zelensky as if he, I don't know, he was Canada's George Washington, or even greater hero than that? I suspect that one of the reasons is that patriotism is so infra-dig in Canada now. Viz what I said earlier about the CBC journalist saying that Canadian flags made her anxious, that Canadians will support the patriotic or even nationalist urges of some other country, so long as it isn't Canada. And with this in mind, we see that the Conservative Party of Canada is trying to outdo the Liberal Party as to how pro-Ukrainian it is. This is from the Hill Times. Neil Moss, interim Canadian leader, Conservative Canadian leader, Candice Bergen called for Canada to declare Russian ambassador Oleg Stepanov persona non grata and expel him from Canada, as well as recall Canadian ambassador Alison Leclerc from Russia. So Ukraine has a dispute with Russia, a dispute which goes back many years, which means that we shouldn't have diplomatic relations with Russia, because who needs diplomatic relations anyway? What have diplomatic relations ever done to make the world a better place? Let's go to the chat. Jokin666 says there are no bioweapon installations, but we need to secure them. However, they don't exist, and Putin is planting a false flag with them. Hello to Dan and Dan Allison and Run, David the Gnome, Intelligent Design. David the Gnome says, LOL, the false flag interchange with Rubio was something else. Indeed, it was. Can you imagine that this callow man was running for president in 2016? That if things had gone a little differently, he might have become president of the United States? I mentioned to a friend at the time, an American friend, that Rubio was surely the most callow, serious presidential candidate since John F. Kennedy in 1960. However, that's a little unfair to John F. Kennedy, who knew a little about the world. And, oh, yes, I'm Cuban and I suffered under Castro. Actually, your family didn't suffer under Castro, Marco Rubio. You lied about that. Your family was doing quite well under the old regime, the Batista regime. But no, you had to portray yourself, your family, as a victim of Castro, because this is what happens when you have massive numbers of immigrants to your country, that the state of Florida is now dominated by the question of how anti-Castro you are, and has been for decades. David the Gnome says, I feel like if you were part of the Anglosphere's world project and ideology, much like the Soviets, you are anti-national in a sense. Hello to Zen Master Football Analysis. who says Kevin is shilling his hotel room. Hello to Denny McDougall. Look at those pillows. Wouldn't you leave? Yeah, I don't know. You use the pillows often enough and they get torn out, well, bent out of shape, and I don't know how to put them back into shape. Okay. Who else do we have here? Hello to Jeff Godley. And Dr. Deadname, I knew a guy from Cameroon. He said there was an ongoing war there between English and French speakers. I'm not surprised. Metal Mike, hello, says both of Trudeau's dads were stubborn authoritarians, and they passed on these traits to Justin. And Metal Mike says the Nazi elements within Ukraine are into ethnic purity. They believe Slavic Ukrainians are not real Ukrainians. Yes, indeed. And Stepan Bandera believed this murderously. Bandera, of course, has many admirers in Ukraine and many admirers in Canada amongst the Ukrainian Canadians. Metal Mike says further, they only value Scandinavian Ukrainians and Tatars. Jeff Godley says left-wing parties want immigration for the cheap votes. Right-wing parties want immigration for the cheap labor. Yes. Yes, indeed. It's a sandwich, as they say. Hello, Sam B. With that eye patch, a headscarf would work with that suit. Cheers from New Mexico. Well, thank you. Jokin666. I liked Kundun. I did like Kundun, Martin Scorsese's movie, very much indeed. And there is a chilling moment in that film where the Dalai Lama is meeting with Mao Zedong, and Mao Zedong makes it clear to him that resistance to the Chinese, to the Han Chinese, is pointless because we are going to flood Tibet with Han Chinese. We are going to replace you in your own country, which is exactly what happened. Yo Mama says, considering how immigrants brought organized crime at an unprecedented level to Canada back in the day, the critics were not wrong. Hello to John S. And to Buddy, obligatory Linda Carter mention. Okay. Is the chat still working? Okay, there we go. Teleologic Jones says, KMG, I don't want to be a pirate. Jerry, obligatory Seinfeld reference. And, okay, Andrew Coyne, who is called a conservative, although he is not. He voted for the NDP. I don't know in the last election, but the election before that. He's a radical autonomist who, of course, believes in global warming and that carbon is mankind's eternal enemy. And, yes, he believed in the sanitary dictatorship. Oh, these libertarians aren't very liberal these days, are they? He has also gone stark raving mad about the Ukraine and Zelensky, who has decided to use 20 million Ukrainians as human shields. Yes, that's the man that we have to risk nuclear war with. And he actually says this in a column published today, that we have to risk nuclear war because of Zelensky. Should we call Putin's bluff? We already have. As the slaughter in Ukraine continues, and who's responsible for that slaughter? The Russians could have flattened Kiev. They could have flattened all of the cities that they want. They have chosen not to do so. Why? Well, I'd say two reasons, probably equally valid. One, genuine humanitarian concerns, and two, fear of the consequences of flattening cities like Kiev. They have offered a safe passage and the like, but the members of the Azov Brigade, and it turns out Zelensky himself, do not like that. And nuclear war, we're talking about nuclear war now. Yep. Let's talk about this false flag. The anti-no-fly zone faction not only assumes near infinite risks of action, well, yeah, nuclear war. There's never been a nuclear war. There's never been a nuclear war. The Americans dropped 2 bombs, nuclear bombs or atomic bombs, on Japan at the end of the war in that theater in 1945, but there's never been a nuclear exchange. But Andrew Coyne, Colonel Coyne, thinks it's worth the risk. but that the risks of inaction are, if not small, then at least known. But what if the slaughter escalates, which is clearly what Zelensky intends? What if we're looking not at hundreds of thousands of dead civilians, but hundreds or thousands, but of hundreds of thousands? Millions? Oh, wow, he's really pushing it there. After the shelling of the Zaporozhye nuclear plant, this cannot be discounted. Well, this was a Ukrainian false flag. For its part, the pro-NFZ position also depends on certain assumptions. It assumes, first, that Ukraine's citizens could not be protected in other less risky ways by supplying Ukraine with fighter jets, for example. And of course, there'd be no collateral damage there, would there? And second, that while Putin won't escalate if we do intervene, he would if we don't, emboldened by our weakness, etc. If we're going to have to fight him anyway, runs the argument, we might as well do it now. But we don't know that, and it's a hell of a bet to place. The better approach, Coyne concludes, might be a strategy of gradualism. Yeah, just like in World War I. How did that work out? Neither ruling out a no-fly zone nor ruling it in, but reserving the right to intervene in proportion to the gravity of the situation on the ground. So that is to say, the more people that Zelensky gets killed, the graver actions we should take. So we're at the mercy of this deranged oligarch. Putin's position is weakening by the day. So you keep saying, Andrew, what might not be possible today might be possible a week from now. In a game of nuclear poker, best to keep your cards close to your chest. Colonel Coyne sounds like one of those monsters from an Adam Curtis documentary, particularly the series that he did on game theory, F Your Buddy, that people are always going to maximize the utility, that people always choose actions that will maximize their utility. Well, at the end of the F Your Buddy, I believe it was documentary, Curtis reveals that studies have shown that contrary to what game theory teaches us, there are only two groups of people who work always to maximize their utility to the detriment of others. And those groups are, one, economists, and keep in mind, that's what Andrew Coyne was trained in. So one, economists, and two, psychopaths. And well, that's where we find ourselves now. I found this interesting piece from a gossip site called Lipstick Alley, which is one of the better known gossip sites. Someone on Twitter had suggested that, don't worry about Zelensky, he'll be, living in a $5 million house in Miami Beach soon enough. Well, this is dated February the 23rd, 2022. The Nezigar Telegram channel, which often publishes sensational information, has published information about the financial situation of Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, who tirelessly implores his Western partners for various kinds of material help. As it turns out, Zelensky himself can help ordinary Ukrainians and replenish the budget. If, for example, he transfers $1.2 billion to the public treasury, it is this amount that is in Zelensky's account at the Costa Rican branch of Dresdner Bank, Latin America. And it was accumulated, as it turned out, through monthly installments that reached the amount of the president of Ukraine from three philanthropists, Ukrainian oligarchs Rinat Akhmetov from First Union Bank, Viktor Pinchuk with Deutsche Bank accounts, and of course, Igor Kolomoisky. He prefers to send transfers from the Banque Nationale de Paris in Geneva. The investigators managed to get acquainted not only with the timing and volume of cash receipts in the Zelensky account in Costa Rica, but also with some of the expenses of the Ukrainian president. So from this account in the United States, they transferred $34 million to buy a villa in Miami. British jewelry house Graf received around $80,000, which seems modest in the context of real estate spending. The head of the Zelensky apparatus, Andrei Yermak, also has a decent amount in the same bank. The balance in his account is now 56 million people, $56 billion. I believe this is called doing well by doing good. How could a Ukrainian comedian become wealthy? It's not possible, is it? It really isn't possible. So there has to be graft there. We know from the Panama Papers that Zelensky has what were at one point secret offshore accounts. Why would a Ukrainian comedian, particularly one who styled himself a man of the people, have secret offshore accounts? Well, because he's an oligarch like the rest of them. Apparently, Zelensky also has some nice property in Italy. Yes, acquired in 2015. Yes, when he worked as a comedian, still had nothing to do with politics, with a value of 3.8 million euros. This is a villa in the community of Forte de Marmine, or Mam, sorry, I get that wrong, in Tuscany. Tuscany. I've never been to Tuscany. I've seen pictures. I saw it in Succession. It is surely one of the most beautiful places in the world. A nice place to live. This is from revolver.news, which is one of the few organs on the right which has maintained its sanity over the Ukraine. According to President Biden in his State of the Union address, the war between Ukraine and Russia is a fight for freedom, a battle between democracy and autocracies. Those countries opposing Russia's invasion are a coalition of other freedom-loving nations. Yeah. Perhaps for Ukraine, the war really is about freedom, although Ukraine is neither as free nor as democratic as Western media portray it. Yes, the sainted Zelensky closed 3 television stations in the Ukraine last year because he didn't like what they were broadcasting. But for the globalist American empire, or GAE, or GAY, the crusade against Russia has nothing to do with democracy or freedom. In fact, the war provides them with a golden opportunity to act out their increasingly dystopian fantasies. The battle against Russia is a new frontier of American policymaking. It is the globalization of Black Lives Matter tactics and cancel culture. It is George Floydism converted from domestic cudgel to foreign policy doctrine. To those who remember summer 2020 or the days after January 6th, the tactics used against Russia will sound quite familiar. After January 6th, major banks systematically cut off President Trump. Deutsche Bank, Signature Bank, and Banks United shuttered his accounts. Signature Bank took the added step of saying it would refuse services to any lawmaker objecting to the results of the 2020 election. Stripe halted payment processing for the Trump campaign, as well as anyone present at January 6th. Recently, Axios reported that American oligarchs have launched a dark money campaign to target the livelihoods of hundreds of lawyers who assisted President Trump in challenging the results of the 2020 election. But while we once had the deplatforming of individuals or companies, we now have the deplatforming of whole countries. Russia has been officially debanked. On the first weekend after the invasion, Western nations booted Russian banks off SWIFT. On the second weekend, Visa, MasterCard, and PayPal shut down their services in Russia, hitting tens of millions who used them for ordinary purchases. Even cryptocurrencies weren't spared. After 2020, America's most powerful law firms lined up to pay homage to George Floyd and pledge vast pro bono resources to BLM. After the presidential election, the press browbeat major firms in refusing to represent Trump in cases challenging the results. Now law firms are being weaponized against Russia, too. Covington and Burling, the #1 law firm in Washington, D.C., announced it will represent Ukraine pro bono in the International Court of Justice, while elite British firm Linklaters is simply closing up shop in Russia entirely. And much more along this lines. Well, we've seen it work. We've seen it in Canada. Oh, you people who donated to what was at the time a legitimate protest in Ottawa, the truckers' convoy, we're seizing your bank accounts. And we've changed the law so that banks don't need court orders to seize bank accounts. And this has something to do with money laundering, which has something to do with terrorism, apparently. As an aside, the last time I paid my internet bill with Shaw, I showed up at the office and they asked me for my late father's middle name. I said, what? They said, your father's middle name. And I gave them my father's middle name. And, oh, yeah. And she said something about security or whatever. Oh, yes, money laundering. This would be a strange kind of money laundering, don't you think? Where an account was paid off $110 per month. No, part of it is just, the joy of making people jump through hoops. Frequently, they ask for my ID. Paying a bill and being forced to present ID, that's not enough. You need your late father's middle name as well. Let's see if the world is blown up. Let's look at Drudge, day 14, Patriot missiles to Poland. CIA warns going to get ugly. It is already ugly. Russia bombs maternity ward. I don't believe it for a second, using thermobaric rockets. Putin chemical weapons fear. Yes, we saw this with little Marco Rubio yesterday. And Jen, not Jennifer, but Jen Psaki said, oh, biolabs, that's all made up. Is she serious? Does she really think she can get away with it? I guess she is serious, and she can get away with it. That Victoria Nuland, Undersecretary of State, and neocon Yas Queen, yesterday talked about, the security of these biolabs in Ukraine, which have heavy American involvement. And then Marco said, well, yes, of course, if something bad happens there, it's the Russians. Yes, it's the Russians. What else do we have? Oligarch renounces citizenship. New Iron Curtain descends on Russia. So many Canadian fighters have their own battalion. Small number of British soldiers may have joined war. Pentagon rejects NATO providing jets. This story keeps going back and forth. That, yeah, Poland's going to provide jets. No, it isn't. Yes, it is. No, it isn't. Yes, it is. Why Poland would want to help what should seem to them the Banderites, who slaughtered as many Poles as they could. Well, these are strange days. I don't think anyone could deny that. And let's go to a roundup of headlines at antiwar.com. Zelensky ready for talks on Crimea, Donbass. Nuland reveals U.S. biological research facilities in Ukraine. Yes, and of course the United States government denies, just like they denied they had anything to do with Wuhan. Yes, gain of function research. That was blown out of the water, but I suppose they're still denying it. Turkey to host top diplomats for Ukraine-Russia peace talks. Ukraine says Russian airstrike hit hospital in Mariupol. This is dangerous. What the governments and the media are doing is that I'm pretty much at the point now where any statement made by the government I reject reflexively. And I know that they're particularly after the Freedom Convoy and what happened there, and our bought and paid for media and their role in demonizing these people. There's an increasing number of Canadians who simply reject out of hand any statement that the government makes. And this is not good in a polity. It's not good. Let's look at the Daily Mail and see what hysteria they've got brewing there. Zelensky begs again for NATO to impose a no-fly zone after horrific bombing of maternity hospital, as he warns millions could die if the West waits for World War III to start. Oh, yes, Andrew Coyne uses this word millions. Zelensky uses this word millions. That would appear to be the Zelensky-Coyne plan, that millions of people are going to die. And if millions of people don't die, they'll claim that millions died anyway. Putin could use chemical or biological weapons after spreading preposterous propaganda. The U.S. is building bioweapons in Ukraine labs, White House warns. Russia could use claims to justify terrifying escalation after barbaric hospital bombing. Desperate battle to find survivors trapped in Mariupol maternity hospital. Rescuers comb rubble after genocide bomb blast as temperatures plunge to minus 4 degrees Celsius, with fears any injured children will freeze to death. And I'm looking at the pictures that the Daily Mail has provided, and I'm not seeing any children there. I suppose local children could be rounded up and made available. Let's go to the Russians with Attitude Twitter feed. And people might ask, why do I go there, RWA and ASB? Because they are two Twitter feeds, unlike almost all of the others, which are making a genuine attempt to provide news about what is going on, as opposed to agitprop, as they used to say in the old Soviet Union. Major progress towards encirclement on all fronts. In Donbass, the Ukrainian position continues to be less and less tenable by the day. No sign of a major pullout yet. This will have to happen, or tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops will be trapped in the kettle. Someone had posted to RWA, more fully immersed in propaganda than people in North Korea. True, people in old school totalitarian states at least know that they are subject to propaganda and have therefore developed a healthy sense of critical thinking, whereas Westerners are as naive as little kids. RWA comments, this is very true. It's why I don't like it when Westerners compare their countries to the USSR. The lying and propaganda may be on the same level, but the average Soviet citizen knew perfectly well that the newspapers were bullshit. No sane Russian would claim that Russia is a liberal democracy or that politicians aren't corrupt or whatever. It's Westoids who religiously believe in whatever their governments tell journalists to say. In the Soviet Union, a naive babushka would say, if we have it this bad, how much worse must it be under capitalism? Nowadays, you've got people in the West getting their bank accounts frozen for donating $5 and worrying about freedom in Russia. LOL. Russia has signed a new law that allows all civilians to carry weapons of war and use them against Russian soldiers. Congrats on turning 20 million people into unlawful combatants, I guess. Yes, there's a reason why soldiers, members of the armed forces, wear uniforms, which is to distinguish them from citizens. Because if soldiers were not identified with uniforms, then the enemy would simply kill everybody they see, which seems to be what Zelensky and his allies in the West want to happen. Regarding the hospital in Mariupol, you know I'm not a person, says RWA, who screams false flag at everything he dislikes. And even if it were hit by Russian artillery, that's a tragedy, but the natural consequence of refusing to evacuate civilians and placing weapons in hospitals. Well, if you read Tom Wolfe, Jousting with Sam and Charlie, about the aerial war in North Vietnam, you know, this is precisely what the North Vietnamese did. The rules of engagement forbade American pilots from hitting schools and hospitals. So North Vietnam bolted anti-aircraft batteries and SAM batteries onto the roofs of schools and hospitals. The assumption is that the Russians are going to put up with this, that they're going to allow themselves to be killed and their materiel destroyed by Ukrainians who cynically exploit humanitarian considerations. Well, I don't know how long these humanitarian considerations are going to last, given what we have seen in the last 10 days. The U.S. threatens to sanction China for not sanctioning Russia. Oh, that is just so rich. What would the NBA have to say about this? They wouldn't be very happy. What would Disney have to say about this? They wouldn't be very happy, would they? The U.S. says it opposes NATO nations providing fighter jets to Ukraine a day after Poland offered MiG-29s. A Pentagon spokesman says the planes wouldn't help Ukraine's defense as much, but would risk a significant Russian reaction. That's reported by the Associated Press. LPR troops took control of the settlements of Zatishnoye, Peshchenka, and Surovtsevka. Ukrainian military positions on fire in Kharkov. Let's go to Pedro Gonzalez's Twitter feed. He is an editor at Chronicles magazine. And Pedro Gonzalez says Massey, that would be Representative Massey, has been consistently solid on this issue. And he's right again. These sanctions make zero sense if we aren't going to become energy independent and fast. They just force middle America to bear the brunt of the ruling class's interest. Daniel Horowitz commented on that. Massey has some sort of vaccine that immunizes him from virtue signaling. He actually uses his brain and will not waver in the face of social media orgies that entice every other fake conservative. But again, don't call yourself conservative. Gonzalez writes, focus all your attention on Russia and stand with Ukraine. Don't mind this. This is from, I believe, NBC News. Biden takes big step toward government-backed digital currency. You know what that means, don't you? The government doesn't like you. You don't have any money anymore. The news cycle in the last 24 hours. No, the U.S. wasn't developing chemical weapons in Ukraine. That's crazy. Victoria Nuland's testimony suggests that the U.S. was, and that she's worried the Russians will find them. Russia might use chemical weapons in Ukraine. Look, we went through this in Syria. That Assad used poison gas on his people. That was an obvious false flag right from the very beginning. And despite various people moving heaven and earth to suppress the truth has come out. No, that it wasn't Assad that was responsible. Let's go to Clint Ehrlich's Twitter feed. Anya Parampil tweets, Florida Representative Maria Salazar says she supports a no-fly zone in Ukraine, even though she doesn't, quote, know what it would mean, unquote, before adding, freedom is not free. When asked if the U.S. should shoot down Russian planes, she says, of course, and there's a video attached. Ehrlich comments, zombie politicians are leading us towards a world war. The Congresswoman supports a no-fly zone with Russia, even though she doesn't know what it would mean. Jennifer Psaki tweeted, now that Russia has made these false claims and China has seemingly endorsed this propaganda, we should all be on the lookout for Russia to possibly use chemical or biological weapons in Ukraine or to create a false flag operation using them. It's a clear pattern. What pattern? What are the previous examples, Jen? Ehrlich comments, the White House claims Russia is about to use chemical weapons in Ukraine. Someone should ask the White House whether alleged chemical attacks are a red line for America entering the war. Russia is escalating its controversial claims about U.S. bioweapons in Ukraine. Today, a member of the Academy of Military Sciences, Alexander Bartosz, claimed America was developing gene weapons in Ukraine. And let's take a look at Summit News. Yes, I mentioned this yesterday. Biden tried to ask Saudis and the United Arab Emirates for more oil, but they refused to take his calls. Viktor Orban refuses to punish Hungarian families for Russia-Ukraine war. Energy industry heads call out Biden administration's misinformation on record high prices. U.S. intelligence officials warn Putin could nuke a Ukrainian city. Again, it seems that all of the crises that we're undergoing now are merging into one. It's just one continuing crisis. The Trump election in 2016, supposedly stolen by Putin, the resistance against Trump, la résistance against Trump, the 2020 election, COVID-19, Black Lives Matter, and now this. But a strange thing has happened, or a strange thing has been, I suppose, been revealed by this sanctions crisis, which is that before we got the sanctions against Russia, no one seemed to really think through what the results were going to be. And this is following on the so-called shift to green power. As I described it on Twitter today, first we made the suburbs and then the exurbs. Then we persuaded or compelled tens of millions to live there, making them utterly dependent on cheap and abundant gas. Then we decided oil was evil and best left in the ground, making transportation unaffordable for millions. No problem. Buy a Tesla. How much does a Tesla cost? Well, what's the cheapest Tesla? Huh? $30,000? Something like that? Wait a minute. How much does a Tesla cost? Okay. Let's see. Model 3, $45,000. Well, I don't know whether there are cheaper ones than that, but that's the sort of money that people have just lying around the house, right? You can just write off your car or your cars, because many families have more than one. Just write them off and get a Tesla or Teslas, and then you won't have to worry about the price of gas anymore. You can use electricity instead, and electricity has no bad ecological effects because, as we all know, electricity comes from lightning. Benjamin Franklin taught us that. Electricity is captured by vast lightning factories around the world. Let's go to information liberation. Yes, we know this already. Oh, Patriarch Kirill, spiritual leader of the Russian Orthodox Church, says Sunday that the conflict in Donbass is a metaphysical battle. It's a battle against a godless international order built on gay pride parades. Neocons working to foment insurgency in Ukraine, turn country into the next Afghanistan. I don't know. Are there a lot of mountains and caves in Ukraine? Not to the best of my knowledge. There's a lot of flatlands there, actually. Again, and let's see if there's anything interesting at Vox Day. He comments on Marco Rubio's attempt to pre-sell a false flag operation. I wonder if this was worked out beforehand. He kind of botched it, actually. He's a very nervous speaker, which we learned in 2016. Now, again, this is from RT, and apparently there are moves afoot to remove RT entirely from the internet, but one can still access it, at least I can, in Canada. And again, this is a Russian claim. Okay, it's just a claim, and you know my thought on claims, that we are to be skeptical of them in the absence of independent evidence. But of course, everything that Zelensky says must be true because he is a living saint. Anyway, the Russian Ministry of Defense on Wednesday accused Ukrainian nationalist forces of committing an extremely dangerous provocation by attacking a substation and power lines which provide the Chernobyl nuclear power plant with electricity. Earlier, Ukrainian authorities claimed that the power cut was Russia's fault and could put Europe in danger. At the moment, the Ukrainian side is doing everything possible to avoid the organization of repair and restoration work. In our opinion, this once again confirms the absolutely deliberate and provocative character of the actions of the nationalists, and that's according to Deputy Defense Minister Nikolai Pankov. And, oh yes, Zelensky, who is, he made a speech, he spoke to the House of Commons in London, and now he's going to speak to the House of Commons in Ottawa. You think this was Winston Churchill taking a victory lap after 1945? This is from Kane at Citizen Free Press. On Wednesday, Zelensky fired back against the charge that Poland's offer of MiG jets was unfounded and reminded his Western allies that Putin's invading forces have routinely used missiles, aircraft, and helicopters in its assault on Ukraine and its civilian population. You know, the Ukraine is getting vast amounts of war materiel from the West, vast amounts. You know, not just rifles, automatic rifles and ammunition, but sophisticated weapon systems. And there's no question that a great many of these weapons will end up in the hands of gangsters. gangsters of all types. I wonder how soon before we see them appear in Mexican narco states. And this is from Reuters. U.S. rejects Poland's offer to give it Russian-made fighter jets for Ukraine because it raised serious concerns for the entire NATO alliance, according to the Pentagon. This story is an absolute mystery. Did any of this actually happen? Because I'm kind of leading to the conclusion that it never happened, but it was just an attempt to frighten Putin. Oh, by the way, as we know, there's no, biolabs in the Ukraine, and the United States has nothing to do with them, except I found this story from the Arms Control Association going back to 2005. Threat reduction program extends reach to Ukrainian biological facilities. U.S. cooperation with Ukraine under the Nunn-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program was expanded August 29th, 2005, with an agreement to use U.S. funds to improve security for pathogens. Pathogens are not a good thing. Stored at biological research and health facilities in the former Soviet Republic. Under the agreement, CTR funds will for the first time flow directly to projects aimed at securing pathogen strains and sensitive biological knowledge within Ukraine. The United States will also work to improve Ukrainian capabilities to direct, diagnose, and treat outbreaks of infectious diseases, as well as determine whether outbreaks are natural or the result of bioterrorism. Again, this is from 2005. And Glenn Greenwald has something to say about that, posted at his Substack 7 hours ago. Victoria Nuland, Ukraine has biological research facilities, worried Russia may seize them. The neocon's confession sheds critical light on the U.S. role in Ukraine and raises vital questions about these labs that deserve answers. Self-anointed fact-checkers in the U.S. corporate press have spent 2 weeks mocking as disinformation and a false conspiracy theory the claim that Ukraine has biological weapons labs, either alone or with U.S. support. They never presented any evidence for the ruling. How could they possibly know? And how could they prove the negative? But nonetheless, they invoke their characteristically authoritative, above-it-all tone of self-assurance and self-arrogated right to decree the truth, definitively labeling such claims false. Claims that Ukraine currently maintains dangerous biological weapons labs came from Russia as well as China. Yet U.S. fact-checkers dutifully and reflexively sided with the U.S. government to declare such claims disinformation and to mock them as QAnon conspiracy theories. Unfortunately for this propaganda racket masquerading as neutral and high-minded fact-checking, the neocon official long in charge of U.S. policy in Ukraine testified on Monday before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and strongly suggested that such claims are, at least in part, true. Rubio asked, did Ukraine have chemical or biological weapons? He undoubtedly expected a flat denial by Nuland, thus providing further so-called proof that such speculation is dastardly fake news emanating from the Kremlin, the CCP, and QAnon. Instead, Nuland did something completely uncharacteristic for her, for neocons, and for senior U.S. foreign policy officials. For some reason, she told a version of the truth. Her answer visibly stunned Rubio. Rubio's cleanup act came too late. When asked whether Ukraine possesses chemical or biological weapons, Nuland did not deny this at all. She instead, with palpable pen-twirling discomfort and in a halting speech, a glaring contrast to her normally cocky style of speaking in obfuscatory State Department officialese, acknowledged Ukraine has biological research facilities. Any hope to depict such facilities as benign or banal was immediately destroyed by the warning. She quickly added, we are now, in fact, quite concerned that Russian forces may be seeking to gain control of those labs. So we are working with Ukrainians on how they, yes, apparently she pronounces Ukrainians in some strange way. What in those Ukrainian biological labs that makes them so worrisome and dangerous, and has Ukraine, not exactly known for being a great power with advanced biological research, had the assistance of any other countries in developing those dangerous substances? And is American assistance confined to what Newland described at the hearing, working with the Ukrainians on how they can prevent any of those research materials from falling into the hands of Russian forces? Or did the U.S. assistance extend to the construction and development of the biological research facilities themselves? And much more from this by Glenn Greenwald at Substack. But by now, when almost 2 weeks into this war, it is almost a certainty that anything denied by the Ukraine or the United States with regard to the Ukraine is in fact true. And there is a piece at Unheard by Eris Roussenos. Is this Ukraine's last chance for peace? Nearly 2 weeks into the invasion of Ukraine, observing from a distance, it still feels as if there are two different wars which barely overlap taking place. The first is the war on social media. In this war, a combination of genuine and impressive Ukrainian tactical successes and inspiring, but self-evidently dubious propaganda stories meld into a narrative of a shambolic Russian army falling apart after failing to seize Kiev on the first day of war and sinking into a quagmire it cannot win. Boosted by social media influencers, some online veterans of earlier narrative wars, this is clearly the dominant framework, a heroic David and Goliath story, emotionally resonant to external well-wishers. And then there's the second war, the one on the ground. Every day, new maps are released by professional and amateur military analysts, which make grim reading for Ukraine's supporters. In the south and in the east, a great pincer is slowly grinding forward to surround the bulk of Ukraine's troops deployed along the line of contact against a separatist, that is, pro-Russian Ukrainian forces. If these Ukrainian troops do not withdraw soon and form a new defensive line further to the northwest, they will be encircled, starved of supplies, and rendered ineffective. In smaller pockets, like the defenders of Mariupol, they will simply be destroyed by artillery. In the northeast, Russian troops have bypassed the near-besieged city of Kharkov, nearly encircled the strategic city of Chernihiv, and are moving in force on Kiev's eastern suburbs. Around a week ago, the first reconnaissance units were seen outside the satellite town of Brovary. Now they have been reinforced with armored battalion tactical groups and artillery units, which have begun shelling the area around Kiev's Boryspil International Airport, presumably to soften it up for continuing to tighten their noose around the city. Well, apparently there have been talks, and apparently Zelensky has, so we hear, has indicated willingness to take part or consider concessions. Who knows whether all that is true? I think the author is right that if there is not a peace agreement made soon, then the Russians are going to decide that the Ukrainians and their NATO and American allies are not acting in good faith and are prepared to use the whole of the Ukrainian population as human shields and will act accordingly. God forbid that happen, but this war is now, moved into the realm of necessity. Before I move on, talk about Germany. Frank Wright, who I've mentioned in this space before, he has a Substack, which I highly recommend. And he has a piece posted within the last day called "Where Would We Be Without Hitler? How to Avoid Noticing Things." And a version of this appears on that excellent site of The Conservative Woman. He begins, "It is taboo to notice things as they are, to, in the words of Roy Walker on Catchphrase, say what you see. Since reality is composed of elements unwilling to conform to the rainbow prejudices of the regime, it is the senses by which reality is experienced which are now seen to be doubtful. You are told you are an idiot to believe the evidence of your own eyes. The very phrase lived experience is composed to condescend to people who have witnessed the truth of social decay, crime, cultural strife, and the discomfiting harangues of men in drag demanding to be taken extremely seriously. Lived experience is never to be dismissed, of course, but it cannot hope to reflect the complex and multiple causes of obvious problem X. These complex and multiple causes are never explained or even named. It is enough for the wool puller to hand you the balaclava of bunkum that you might meekly apply it to yourself. The eye holes to the back of the head, of course, lest any more of that lived experience creeps in to poison your new perspective. What was once obvious is now obscured by clever jargon. Ultra-crepidarian scolds rule the Twitterverse, instant experts on any hot topic, swift and inflexible as the justice of Robespierre in dogpiling the unwary. There is only one crime, although it has many names. It is telling the truth. If you recognize basic facts about people and their habits, you may find them broadly corresponded to forbidden categories. This is because they do correspond. Recognizing patterns or stereotypes in this matter is taboo. Why is this the case? To flatter a certain way of seeing the world, people are imagined as the dots in pointillist picture, each identical in a sense but unique, a universe unto themselves. If the world is shattered into these atoms, each with its own orbits, no general description can do justice to their irreducibly complex and ultimately ungraspable identity. It is our reality that matters, not the one outside the heads. Frank Wright continues. It is a symptom of internalized social collapse, a retreat into make-believe, which makes an enemy of the basic observation of reality. The retreat and balaclava of wisdom are required to prevent you having to notice anything which might upset your delicate theories of how the world ought to be rather than how it is. The sensible thing to do when confronted with unpleasant news is to ignore it. If you get good at this, you can develop a kind of armor, a thought helmet, which runs on brain power and keeps bad news out of your head, leaving you to get on with your happy thoughts in peace. Reality has been exceptionally off message in these last few years, quite an achievement in itself, given its appalling track record. I think it is time for a customer services department for reality so it can get the one-star review it richly deserves. Let's cast an eye over its many violations of the terms of service. In no particular order, because it's arguable there isn't one anymore, what has happened to the free world? We don't hear much about it anymore, perhaps because it has not been feeling too clever. If you are, perhaps you have noticed that there isn't much freedom in the world formerly known as free. Speech, privacy, movement, who you have round your house, whether you'd like these injections or to lose your job, your holidays, miserable. A lot of this is obviously pinged off the thought helmet because it's awful. What about the fact that you couldn't go to the pub, but the foreign working class could rocket up in Dover before being carted off for a pizza and a room in a Holiday Inn? That is so wrong, it has to be a racist lie. Doing. Of course, if you haven't changed your avatar to something reflecting the current thing, you must support the current Hitler. Hitler of the year 2022 is, of course, Putler. Under George Bush, the Hitler of the year 1990 was Saddam. Later, according to Miss Lindsay, Gaddafi was Hitler of the year 2011. John Kerry, among others, nominated Assad for Hitler of the year in 2013. The Hitler of the year 2016 was, according to Boris Johnson, the European Union, which was a bad year to pick given the outstanding success of that year's undisputed champion, His Imperial Majesty Dr. Donald J. Trump, PhD. A step change came in 2017 when Thomas the Fascist Tank Engine came out of nowhere to grasp the crown. This new field saw a strong contender in Paw Patrol and their human slave driver, Ryder. In 2018, even Jeremy Corbyn had a turn. PBS, not to be outdone by a train with a face, upped the ante considerably with this 2021 triple Hitler boot smash, combining Matteo Salvini, Viktor Orban, and Marine Le Pen. Too many Hitlers spoil the froth, so occasionally there are regional and not international Hitlers. Domestically, our Hitlers stand athwart the political spectrum like a menacing colossus. We are never short of contenders. David Lammy, mastermind and Renaissance grifter, nominated Jacob Rees-Mogg as 2019 Hitler of the Year, only to resile his position because Hitler, in his view, had not been bad enough to merit the comparison. The entire Conservative Party have also been Hitler. The keen student of current Hitlerism will not forget that our own Bordorf Hitlerson enjoyed a moment in the jackboots, robbing a gobsmacked Nigel Dorf for Hitler of a title he must have considered his by right. David Starkey is a great Hitler spotter, seeing Hitler in 2012 and 2015 in Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon, respectively. As you can see, perhaps the only thing which can penetrate the thought helmet is a Hitler. The only thing that can stop him, better change that avatar quick, lest you turn up in a mustache meme yourself. And again, that is the excellent Frank Wright from his stack. I want to talk about Germany briefly. Germany is supposed to be a free country, but it isn't. This is from Reuters yesterday. German spy agency may surveil far-right AfD party, the court rules. That is the Alliance for Deutschland. A German court Tuesday ruled that the domestic spy agency was justified in placing the AfD under surveillance on suspicion of being a threat to democracy. Yes, you see, because when you run against, the socialists, the Christian Democrats, and the so-called Social Democrats, Die Linke, the Green Party, whatever, you're a threat to democracy because you are outside the consensus. And it has now been decreed that only parties within the consensus, as defined by the consensus, are legitimate democratic parties. The radical nationalist faction of the AfD, known as the Wing, had been formally dissolved, but its protagonists continued to exert influence within the party, said the court in the western city of Cologne, where the spy agency is based. A policy goal of the Wing, as well as the AfD youth organization, the Young Alternative, was to protect the ethnic integrity of the German people and keep out foreigners, the court said. This was at odds with Germany's democratic constitution. Apparently, Germany's constitution says that it should be overrun by fractious and rebarbative foreigners. Apparently, that's in their constitution. Actually, I don't believe that, but this is the way that Reuters has it. The court said it detected agitation against foreigners within the anti-immigration party. The ruling dealt a blow to the AfD after the court on two previous occasions restricted the BFV domestic intelligence agencies monitoring the party on the grounds that such activities put it at a disadvantage and amounted to interference with the democratic process. So you see, but when the Democrats decide to use what some might consider to be anti-democratic measures to protect democracy, their democracy, the system in which they always win, and its opponents are traitors by definition, that is the highest measure, the zenith, one might say, of democracy. Do you get it yet? Here's another story about Germany, which is clearly no longer a free country. And again, this is from our friend Eugipius, and it's called Long Lauterbach. On the 20th of March, in just 15 days, Germany's Infection Protection Act expires. If nobody does anything, the whole legislative basis of containment will simply disappear. That is how easy a Freedom Day could be in Germany, and with the entire attention of the press on Ukraine, you think nothing could be simpler than letting that happen. Alas, Karl Lauterbach is our health minister, and we have the worst government since the war. On the 16th of February, we learned that the plan was to replace the Infection Protection Act and its more intrusive protections with simple basic protection measures to contain infections and protect at-risk groups. Today, this was a few days ago, in a very bad interview with the Westdeutsche Allgemeine Zeitung, Lauterbach finally explains what he hopes that these simple basic protection measures will amount to. They are anything but simple or basic. Quote, German states must have the capacity to react early to future waves. This includes mask mandates and contact restrictions. It should be possible to set limits on the size of private meetings and public events, as well as access rules for restaurants, for example, that is to say, vaccination and testing requirements. To this end, Lauterbach continued, we must still have the capacity to implement testing requirements for businesses and public spaces. All these instruments should only be used if they are actually necessary. The state parliaments would then have to determine this, unquote. Eugipius comments, all of this will remain necessary for a very long time. Lauterbach counts on a summer wave and a fall wave after that. In fact, he envisions just wave after wave forever. More from Lauterbach. Corona will occupy us for a long time, a decade or more. HIV appeared 40 years ago and is still there. We'll always have to deal with corona variants, perhaps also dangerous variants. There will also always be outbreaks. That's what you call the endemic phase. And there will be a group of people who are not adequately vaccinated, whose vaccine protection is waning, and for whom the vaccine protection is insufficient because of weak immune systems, unquote. Always new little problems for the new little Lauterbachs of our government to solve. This new law will be pushed through Parliament with as little discussion as possible. Olaf Scholz's coalition is supposed to present draft legislation to a parliamentary subcommittee by the 16th of March. A full vote is then planned for the 18th, preceded by a mere 70 minutes of debate. 2 years ago, when the law was first passed, things went much the same way. It was also urgent, you see. Now the reasons are, of course, much different. The last thing any member of parliament wants to be is on the record supporting these indefensible rules and the continued destruction of German society. So the most minute aspects of our everyday life will continue to be regulated in relative silence by unreasonable people for unattainable ends. So no, I don't think that Germany is a free country anymore. Of course, I'm not really one to carp here because Canada stopped being a free country a long time ago. But it's in the interests of democracy. You know, freedom isn't free, as that representative who wants a no-fly zone reminded us. The next big lies, January 6th was no big deal or a left-wing plot. How revisionist histories of January 6th picked up where Stop the Steal campaign left off, warping beliefs about what transpired at the Capitol. This is from Matthew Rosenberg, Jim Rutenberg, and Michael Grinbaum in the New York Times, January 6, 2022. Matthew Rosenberg, eh? What say you now, Matthew Rosenberg? This is from Tyler Durden at Zero Hedge. New York Times reporter said tons of FBI informants were at JSIC, calls traumatized fellow journos bitches. Can't a lonely New York Times journalist try to get laid without a Project Veritas operative tricking him into loose lips? As Project Veritas reports, the answer is once again no. Meet Matt. That would be their national security reporter. Now read what Matt said about FBI informants at the January 6th insurrection, along with a host of other revelations. He contradicted his own January 6th reporting, quote, there were a ton of FBI informants among the people who attacked the Capitol, unquote. It was like me and two other colleagues who were there outside, and we were just having fun. I know I'm supposed to be traumatized, but like all these colleagues who were in the Capitol building and are like, oh my God, it was so scary. I'm like, F off. I'm like, come on. It's not the kind of place I can tell someone to man up, but I kind of want to be like, dude, come on. You were not in any danger. Those effing little dweebs who keep going on about their trauma. Shut the F up. They're effing bitches. They were making too big a deal. They were making this an organized thing that it wasn't. Will I stand by those comments? Absolutely. And this is on video. But don't expect the New York Times to do anything about it, or the rest of the bought and paid for media who are temple prostitutes, really, to even mention this, because despite the fact that Project Veritas continues to get the goods, no, we can't mention that, of course, because it wouldn't be democratic, because it hurts the narrative. Yes, I have mentioned the little boy, Pavlik Morozov, who became a hero in the Soviet Union for ratting out his parents, even though this may never have happened, or he may never have existed, but he became one of the great myths of the Soviet Union. This is from Kara Kastornuova at the Gateway Pundit. January 6th protester Guy Reffitt was found guilty on all 5 felony charges he faced today in a Washington, D.C. court. His attorney called no witnesses to the stand in his defense. He did not testify in his own defense. He was charged with bringing a gun to the U.S. Capitol after his son recorded him in their home wearing an FBI wire. Yeah, how about that? How about that? An FBI wire. Good Lord, says Gateway Pundit. This is like something from the Soviet Union or Communist Cuba. How horrible. The Department of Justice prosecutors manipulatively walked back their decision to subpoena another child of January 6th defendant Guy Reffitt to the stand after using his teenage son against him this past Friday as a witness. The DOJ had planned to also use Refet's minor daughter as a prosecution witness before realizing their diabolical plan was going to backfire at the last minute. And let's go to the chat, see if there's anything going on there. Look. It is difficult I suppose I feel like, Europeans felt in the summer of 1914. Are we just going to sleepwalk into disaster here? People are actually talking about nuclear war. Yeah, sure, it might end up with a nuclear exchange, but I can live with those odds. Really, you can live with those odds. Perhaps we should move, Andrew Coyne, Colonel Coyne, and the like a little closer to the action. Maybe move them to Hungary or Poland, say, or Slovakia. Move them there. So if the nuclear exchange happens, even a relatively limited nuclear exchange, they could derive all the benefit from radiation poisoning. David the Gnome says, I like the Christian right-wing America. Oscar Toe says the feds have some serious ethical issues and everyone is afraid to mention this obvious truth. Emmett Kelly sir says, hello, KMG. I hope your eye is better. As I mentioned yesterday, it's about 50% less hideous than it was a week ago, but this has been 3 weeks now, and I'm beginning to suspect that I may have broken or chipped a bone in my head. Yes, I'm not saying we won't get our hair mussed up a bit, says Ann Run. True Greenbird says, looks like we are wide awake, but still walking into disaster. I don't know what that's called, but it's not sleepwalking. Hello to Metatron, who says millennials think war is like a video game. I'm sure they do. Contracoup, hello, says at this rate, there will no doubt be gulags in the U.S. in 10 years or less. Oh no, Kevin, why not get it checked? Well, I guess I'm going to have to now. I don't like going to the doctor. Who else do we have here? When social distancing, I used to say, 2 Meter bitte to Americans. Their expressions were of terror. Oh, anyone else here? Hello to Dan says, Lauterbach gives Bonnie Henry a run for the big pharma money. Oscar Toe says, history will tell future kids that Trump was possibly worse than Hitler. Well, Sarah Silverman said this as far back as 2016. So I'm not sure I can trust any portion of history at this point. The Crit School of Icons is also much admired, says Birkin Sultanov. Kevin only needs a white Russian cat on his lap now to go with the eye patch. Well, you can't see my lap. It's down there somewhere. And I'm not fond of long-haired cats for various reasons. Who else do we got? Do we got anyone else here? Yes, and Master Football Analysis, Hitler has only got one ball. The other is in the Albert Hall. His mother has got the other, and now he ain't got none at all. Bum, bum, bum. Yes. As far as I've been able to tell, this was all made up by the British intelligence service in order to make him look bad. He was bad enough, of course, but all this stuff about him chewing carpets, no, this was all made up as well. Apparently, first jailing large number of the people and then killing millions of people is not enough. You have to make up rather trivial lies. One from World War II. Whistle while you work. Hitler is a jerk. Mussolini broke his weenie. Now it doesn't work. Dr. Dende says self-replicating Hitler like a von Neumann machine. PBS Frontline documentaries look amateurish next to RTs, says Birkin Sultanov. Okay, let's get back to it here. Oh, yes, Shogakin 666 points out Russia didn't flatten Grozny until they had to flatten Grozny. Again, Grozny literally means terrible, or you could say awesome, or awe in the original sense of awe, not as in awesome sauce. How much time do we have left here? Oh yeah, this is from Unheard, and Catherine Bayford. Sorry, Sheryl Sandberg, but women do go to war. No two countries run by women would ever go to war, Sheryl Sandberg, chief operating officer of Meta and proponent of the lean-in brand of corporate feminism, stated in a Cartier-sponsored Dubai speech on International Women's Day. Everything about that is wrong. Dubai? Yeah, International Women's Day, huge thing there. Cartier? Really? Lean in, Sheryl Sandberg. Why is Sheryl Sandberg where she is now? Because of the people that she met along the way. America has become an oligarchy, but nobody wants to admit it. Sheryl Sandberg is just so genius intelligence, super genius, a John von Neumann level genius, apparently. But of course, she isn't. This is a rather peculiar claim. It was, after all, the Russian Empress Catherine the Great who organized the death of her husband and the extension of her empire by 200,000 square miles. Did she realize how badly this would reflect on 21st century corporate feminism? It wasn't just Catherine either. Boudica made a point of cutting Roman citizens in half. Cleopatra took great delight in warring against the ascendant young Octavian. And it was Elizabeth I who told her army at Tilbury, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too. Rather than any dishonor shall grow by me, I myself shall take up arms. I myself will be your general." From the ancient world to contemporary, evidence abounds of women being eminently capable of military command, political maneuvering, and bloodlust. One only needs to look back as far as Indira Gandhi, Golda Meir, and Margaret Thatcher for confirmation of this. Stateswomen, much like statesmen, understand that war is sometimes a necessary evil. They too understand that war can be beneficial, thrilling, or politically popular. Statistically, in fact, women have been more likely to go to war than men. This line of thinking that women are somehow not susceptible to the same desires and emotions as men has spread elsewhere too. It was only 8 years ago when the then ECB chief, Christine Lagarde, claimed that it would be a different world if Lehman Brothers was Lehman Sisters. Women are not an amorphous blob of girl boss empowerment or vessels of noble, peaceful, liberal statecraft. Some women conquer territory, others run banks. They are, after all, human, and as such suffer all the multidimensional, complex desires and fears that make up the human condition. The idea that having 400 ng over dl less testosterone will prevent women from understanding the need for war or the will to undertake it is a fantasy. Can women not feel the same call to war than men do? Must they always be its victim rather than its master? It is patronizing to think this way. Women go to war, and believe it or not, some enjoy it too. Well, you may have heard it was a commonplace. When America was involved in World War I and World War II, for the gals, for the girlfriends of the servicemen to say something along the lines of, "Kill a German for me, Johnny." But there was something similar. Was this from the Carnegie Endowment for World Peace? Hang on, just let me call this up, because I came across this and I thought that it was so funny. Girl boss stuff. But girl bosses are it's got nothing to do with killing people or being really, really rude or nasty or anything like that. Yes, and here we go. Aaron McIntyre had called this clown world hegemony, and this is from the Carnegie Corporation. Quote, the question is asked, what does feminism have to do with nuclear policy? Oh, do tell. Nuclear weapons treaties, policies, and practices have traditionally been developed and negotiated in deeply patriarchal and elitist spaces. Boo! A new report from Feminist TFP, I don't know what that is, shares knowledge, expertise, and historically marginalized perspectives to shape better nuclear policy. To which I responded, all American women are deeply pacifist. Just ask Hillary Clinton or Victoria Nuland, Susan Rice, Samantha Power, Michelle Flournoy, Liz Cheney, Nikki Haley, and the list goes on. These days, of course, it seems that the women are more warlike than the men. Although, again, it's, the old story, the old female story of let's you and him fight for, their amusement, it would seem. And multipolarity, that's the goal. That's the goal. Visionary Companion says it was even worse than kill one of them for me. There were puff pieces about gals who boyfriends sent them Japanese skulls as souvenirs. Anyone who thinks women can't be vicious have never attended a New York City public school. Well, I've seen the videos, but do you remember, again, obligatory Seinfeld reference, when George was talking about being bullied at high school by the gym teacher who called him "can't stand ya" and the wedgie, and Elaine was expressing horror at this, the physical chastisement. And so I think it was Jerry said, so what do women then? What do women do? And Elaine said, oh, we just tease someone until they get an eating disorder, which is pretty much the truth. Don Willis says the eye patch would look better with a Sting logo. Okay. Does Sting have his own logo? Girl boss. How can we... What kind of... Do we live in any... Is there any level of seriousness left where terms like this, are you seriously girl boss? Leaning in. Oh, so you get ahead in business by leaning in. Really? I had no idea. And apparently women can do that too, because before Sheryl Sandberg, no woman had ever had the thought of leaning in to advance. Of course, there are many different ways of leaning in. You can marry the boss, like Hillary Clinton did, or Michelle Obama, who is being seriously touted as a 2020 Democratic presidential candidate. Zen Master says also the UN HQ building, the next fully attended NATO meeting, and Davos gathering. Che Blutarsky says the lesson of the post-Weimar era is don't put a guy in charge who went through a gas attack and whose dad was his mom's uncle. Okay. We're talking about nuclear war here. We're seriously talking about nuclear war here. And again, for all the talk about, I mentioned, previously that Irving Kristol had said circa 1979 or 1980 that NATO should be abolished, that it didn't serve any purpose. And one of the reasons that Irving Kristol said this was, did anyone seriously believe that if the fabled Soviet troops broke through at the Fulda Gap, that the United States was going to determine to blow up the world because of it? No. Very few people seriously believe that. And, mutually assured destruction, the whole point is to prevent a nuclear exchange. That was the argument. I don't know how actually logical that is. It seems kind of insane to me. I suppose that was the whole point of Kubrick's movie, Dr. Strangelove. In fact, if you know the genesis of the movie, that there was a best-selling book called Failsafe, which was about MAD, MAD, get it? It was by these two authors. They were a double team, Eugene Burdick and Harvey Wheeler. And I believe they wrote a bunch of bestsellers. The Ugly American. Yeah, that was another one, which was made into a movie. And of course, Failsafe was made into a hit movie in 1964, starring Henry Fonda as the President of the United States and Dan O'Herlihy, who, of course, was in RoboCop as the old man and the great Walter Matthau. But in any event, spoiler alert, something happens and the Soviet Union is attacked with an American nuclear weapon. And so Henry Fonda says, yeah, I tell you what, how about tit for tat? Okay? You can destroy New York City. And Stanley Kubrick was absolutely aghast at this, absolutely infuriated. No American president would ever let that happen. And we see the argument in Dr. Strangelove that if, a whole bomber wing has been sent to attack, B-52s has been sent to attack the Soviet Union, and there's nothing we can do about it, then, as George C. Scott says, we might as well hit them as fast, as hard as we can, because they are going to retaliate. And we might, have the element of surprise here. And, we might pull this off. But it's not the sort of thing that one would say, even George C. Scott, his general, he's not going to say this in any other circumstance, because it would be insane to invite a nuclear exchange. But of course, we've forgotten that. And again, why? Boredom, pique, the imp of the perverse. Finally, oh dear. I say a lot of things on this show that may sound made up, but I can assure you that they're not, except when I'm being obviously satirical or sarcastic. This is well documented, and this is Hannah Nightingale at the Post-Millennial. Sexy summer camp led by witch teaches children to masturbate, promotes sex work. The camp features classes like Sex with Me, self-pleasure workshop, which teaches participants how to make the most out of their fapping experience, and features hands-on practice on a person's hands. What else? Oh, this is in Appalachia. They also learn about gender diversity, self-managed abortions. You mean like coat hangers? The Sexy Summer Camp, put on by Sexy Sex Ed, was held in July and August of last year on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Sexy Sex Ed puts on workshops that they say compels. That doesn't sound right. Shouldn't this be voluntary? Compels teenagers and people of all ages. I don't like that conflation there of teenagers and people of all ages to openly discuss personal and political consent, sexual safety, and anatomy using visual and performance art, open dialogue, and popular education methods. Sexy Sex Ed fills a vital gap in reproductive education as a creative, cultural healing solution in rural Appalachia. And it was Christopher Rufo who was leading the war against critical race theory in schools. Another session was simply titled Sex on Drugs, and said that participants would explore the nuances of engaging in sexual activity while using licit and illicit drugs. It seems to be the mainstream opinion now that having sex with another person, well, that person is under the strong influence of drugs, licit or illicit, or alcohol for that matter, constitutes rape, because informed consent cannot be given. But let's look at these 4 fabulous gals, 3 of whom are, needless to say, a fat. Tanya Turner is a femme, fat, queer, magical pleasure worker, educator, and artist. She was raised in rural Kentucky by a host of witchy women, alongside sisters and cousins. A coven-like mountain matriarchy, if you will, on a stony fork. Her craft tools are candles, crystals, oils, plants, music, sex toys. Sorry, that last one doesn't sound very organic, does it? Tarot, the moon, and instincts of the triple water sign. Oh, yes, you believe in astrology, but you're such a rational person. In 2012, Tanya started this Appalachian sex ed collective called Sexy Sex Ed and co-founded the party podcast known as Trillbillies in 2017. With over a decade of rural organizing practice towards healing, whenever you heard that word organizing, it means government money is involved. Now, sometimes corporate money as well, but typically government money. Practice towards healing, abolition, and liberation. She fantasizes about a whole other world. She lives high in a Kentucky mountaintop with lots of plants, a steamy hot tub, and several furry familiars. I don't know whether she's talking about animals or people here, because there is a class of people who call themselves furries. Now, let's look at Tanya. She has the problem glasses, and she's fat. Apart from that, she looks fairly normal. Caitlin Cummings does not. Caitlin Cummings has blue lipstick. Her lower lip is pierced. Her septum is pierced. Of course, she is fat as well. She is self-described as a 23-year-old radical queer mountain woman that grew up in the hollers of Vico, Kentucky. She grew up always hearing about the injustices of the world and wanting to do things to help. She's currently working on a degree in human services where she plans to expand her sex ed work to help people understand that with proper sex ed and body love, you can heal in a lot of different ways, as she has herself. And it goes on and on. WMMT's Girls Rock Camp in Whitesburg, Kentucky, which is a camp made up to empower girls, gender nonconforming, and trans youth with music, self-expression, and self-love, as well as the Cottage, a child abuse advocacy center. Urge to something in Minecraft Rising that handles cases of child abuse in ages 1 to 17 years old. Okay. And then we have Lara Helene, and Helene is spelled Helayne because, of course, who's wearing a t-shirt that says born at the top in blue ink and then perfect in blue ink at the bottom. And then it says the Mattachine Society, which was an early radical homosexual organization. Marsha P. Johnson, never heard of her. Harvey Milk, groomer, ACT UP. Edie Windsor, okay. Lara, with an H at the end, of course, is an 18-year-old musician, songwriter, and activist based in Mount Sterling, Kentucky. Growing up in the Appalachian foothills, Laura's wife and work have been greatly impacted by the magnificence of the mountains. Yeah, okay, mountains. Ooh, banjo. It actually says banjo here. As a young non-binary queer in Appalachia, Lara strives to use their song's voice and life to fight for human rights and systemic change in the region through music, community organizing, there's that word again, organizing, and nonprofit work. Oh, it gets even better. Lara founded their school's first gender sexuality alliance, or in other words, grooming parlor, Open Light, which now has over 45 members. And, she spends time co-facilitating sex education workshops for fellow Appalachian youth from ages 1 to 17, perhaps. Then we have Kirsten, which is not spelled in any way that you'd recognize, Uten, described as a young, fat, differently abled queer community organizer and college student from Southern West Virginia. She works as a Vista in Charleston. That's a LBJ era anti-poverty movement, is it not? And works with kids, because of course she does. She has always dreamt of a space where fat folks are appreciated, normalized, and safer. So she created it. Okay, so here you have 4 lesbians, and they're working with children, teaching them illegal activity, grooming them, as it were. And this is the way we live now. Now, Christopher Rufo, and you can find it real Chris Rufo, R-U-F-O. Here's the agenda for the camp. I'll be doing a more extensive report in the coming weeks. And apparently, they have been striving. Yes, the leaders of Sexy Summer Camp are now attempting to scrub their information from the internet. Why aren't these people under arrest? Okay. Why aren't these people under arrest? I want to see a criminal investigation into every government agency or any NGO that was involved in funding these monsters. You remember that Arthur Miller play, The Crucible? A lot of people had to read it in high school. And it's about Salem witch trials. And it's all made up about witchcraft, completely made up. Well, several hundred years after the Salem witch trials, beginning in about the 1960s, people started to come forward in Salem, Massachusetts, and elsewhere saying that they were witches. No, they just didn't dress up on Halloween. We're not saying they were witches. Of course, they were the good kind of witches, white witches, good witches, like, good Hodgkins. And, oh, yeah, sure. Well, we have religious freedom in America, so why not witches? Why not? These people are communing with the devil for personal power. And you have a neutral opinion on that? Well, apparently we do, and we see where it ends up with open child abuse. Someday a real rain will come, and that is my hopeful message for the end of this show. If Daniel Boone could see this, he would have turned around at the Cumberland Gap, says Yo Mama. Zen Master says Putin makes all his troops watch American reality shows before they go into battle. What was that? There was this American reality show called My Sweet 16 or My Big Fat Sweet 16 or whatever. It was about spoiled brat American children celebrating their 16th birthdays. And Charlie Brooker did a segment on it in one of his shows. And there was some 16-year-old was about to get, I don't know, a BMW or something for her Sweet 16. And her mother had blurted it out the day before the birthday. And the child was screaming, "You ruined the surprise. I hate you. I hate you. I hate you." And Brooker described this show as an Al-Qaeda recruitment video. But of course, pretty much all of reality TV is an Al-Qaeda recruitment video or an ISIS recruitment video. And when we, in the West, when we, take up causes like Afghanistan, which Canada was involved in for around a decade, we are extolling the superiority of our system to their system. Now, yeah, sure, I believe that our system is certainly better than the Taliban, but we're making it awfully hard for ourselves to say, we're bombing you and killing you because you have to be like us because we're better. Well, not for much longer. Zen Master says, I used to read Charlie Brooker's column long before he wrote Black Mirror. He always had a brilliant acerbic wit. And on that bombshell, I'm going to wrap it up. Tomorrow is Theater Thursday. And let me just remind you what movie I will be talking about tomorrow. Just give me a second here. And it is, it's not The Angry Silence. I talked about that last week. So it is The Unknown Soldier, which is a Finnish film from 2017 about the continuation war. And I will be talking about Paul Gottfried's anti-fascism on Friday on the book club. So thank you all so much for tuning in. I greatly appreciate it. I'll be back on the air tomorrow, 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. If you would like to make a donation to the live stream, my PayPal account is linked to Kevin_Grace at hotmail.com. If you're in Canada, Donations may be made to the live stream directly via Interac at kevingrace@shaw.ca. And I leave you with this: in these days of social atomization and civilizational collapse, I dearly wish that you, my dear viewers and listeners, manage to forge a genuine human connection in order to ease the burden. Good night.